With Biden's Supreme Court pick on the Hill today, it has many people questioning the motives of his pick. One of those people expressing concern is former HUD Secretary Dr. Ben Carson. Here's a look. Dr. Ben Carson, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's an honor. Doctor, you've recently said that if President Biden were to pick a black woman, which he has on the Supreme Court, that it would be playing into identity politics. Could you explain that for our audience?
Yeah, we always do better when we do things on the basis of merit and qualifications. Now, it doesn't mean that whoever he picks is not worthy of the position, but it calls into question. And it's really unfair to that individual when you do that. So many people fought for such a long time to make sure that we had equality of opportunity. And, a lot of blood was shed, a lot of people went to prison, and then we just turn around and sort of throw all that out and start saying, we're going to make the qualification something over which a person has no control, their external characteristics. And that's moving in the wrong direction, and we really have to stop that and start asking ourselves, what makes a person who they are? Is it their skin? Is it their hair? Or is it their brain?
Now, Doctor, on that note, you've been spending a lot of time advocating for education. You've been very outspoken about critical race theory. It's boiled to the surface throughout the country. How would you advise parents that are, really not happy about what's being taught in schools between that and mask mandates? How should they channel that energy?
Well, they should get involved. Like the parents in Virginia, go to the school board meetings, demand to be heard, run for school board, recall the people, make people responsible for the decisions, expose what they are advocating. Because some of the things that are being advocated by some of these school boards are things that almost no one would agree with, but no one knows that they're doing it. So exposing them, I think, is very important. And the school boards and the politicians, they have to be reminded that they work for the people. People don't work for them. And they are responsible to the people. And there's a reason that children have parents, because those are the people who are most concerned about their outcome. So to say that they don't have a say in the way that their children are educated is ludicrous. We also need to recognize that it doesn't matter where a person was born, what their circumstances were. In this country, if they get a good education, they write their own ticket. There's been a lot of talk about the wealth gap, and it is substantial between blacks and whites in this country. But is it because of the color of the skin, or are there other things that we should be looking at? If you look at Nigerians and Ghanaians and some other people with black skins who come to this country from outside, there is no wealth gap. You have to ask yourself the question, why is that? And in those families, if you know any Nigerian families, you know that in that household, a bachelor's degree is the baseline. There's so much emphasis on education and on family structure. And we really need to be looking at the real reasons that we're having difficulties in these families rather than blaming everything on racism.
Doctor, appreciate all of your great work and appreciate your time. Thank you.
And I should mention, just in closing, that we have a new book coming out in May called Created Equal: The Painful Past, Confusing Present, and Hopeful Future of Race in America.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas has been hospitalized in Washington, D.C. after experiencing flu-like symptoms. The Supreme Court issued a statement today saying he does not have COVID-19. The statement didn't provide details about the type of infection. Thomas was admitted to the hospital in Washington, D.C. on Friday evening. He's being treated with intravenous antibiotics. The statement says that the justice's symptoms are decreasing and that he is expected to be released in a day or two. To drill or not to drill? This is the question being debated on Capitol Hill by both chambers of Congress. Representative Gary Palmer serves on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and we're happy to have him on to discuss. Congressman Gary Palmer, thank you so much for joining us in the Capitol Report.
Happy to be here, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Congressman, I want to ask you about some of the issues that we're facing here on the domestic front as Americans. There's a lot of pain at the pump right now. Specifically, it's partially due to the conflict in Russia, partially not. But do you think that domestic energy production brought back home here to the U.S. will help lower prices? And if so, how?
Well, it will, because energy is the most ubiquitous part of the entire economy. There's an energy cost in everything. And the water you used this morning to shower, the food you ate, the car or whatever vehicle, whatever means of transportation, if you walked, even your shoes, they all have an energy cost. And it gets compounded along the way, all along the process. So if you can reduce energy cost, your manufacturing costs come down, your production cost comes down, your wholesale and your warehousing and your transportation, so that you don't have a situation where not only are you paying $2 a gallon more for gas than you were in December of 2020, you're now in some cases paying $7 or $8 for a box of cereal, which I saw in my local grocery store just a few days ago.
As I mentioned, you serve on the Energy and Commerce Committee. Some of your Democratic colleagues on the same committee are pushing for the federal government to set up a website where Americans will be able to apply for direct payments, essentially subsidies for these high gas prices. Can you give us any insight into these requests and your thoughts?
Well, the Democrat policies of printing more money is another reason why we have rampant inflation. And you combine that with the increase in energy costs, it's going to make it worse, not better. We could see ourselves at some point, if they don't get their heads straight on this, headed toward hyperinflation. Increasing the money supply, which is what this does, doesn't help. And it makes things worse. I think the Democrats are focused all on climate change. They're totally out of touch with the American people. And I understand we've got an issue with climate change and with CO2 emissions. We can deal with that. We're importing Russian natural gas that has over 40% more emissions than U.S. gas. But we refuse to buy natural gas that's produced right here in the United States because we're trying to eliminate that industry. That makes no sense. So this idea that, well, we'll just send checks to everybody does not make things better. The right policies are to restart construction of the Keystone XL pipeline so that we don't have to depend on Russian oil anymore. We can get oil from Canada, open up our resources. We've got one formation out west, Steve, that holds 3 trillion barrels of recoverable oil. That's 3 times what the entire world's used in the last 100 years. That would definitely have an impact on the world market price for oil.
Congressman, some Democrats are feeling the pressure from their constituents and have been acknowledging that we should ramp up domestic production a little bit, but they say we shouldn't go for the so-called approach to unleash domestic energy production, but instead should focus more on renewable energy from their perspective. It often sounds like there's a conflict between the two. What do you think?
Well, I support renewable energy, but it will not supply the nation's needs, and not in the time frame that the Democrats are pushing. I worked for 2 international engineering companies before starting a think tank, which I ran for 20-something years before I came to Congress. And I can tell you from an engineering perspective, what they're advocating for is not possible. Our power grid, for instance, is a patchwork grid. It wasn't built all at one time. Electricity didn't get to the whole country at the same time. But each part of that requires a consistent base load, which you do not get with solar or turbines. Natural gas, on the other hand, is the cleanest fossil fuel that we have. You build one of those facilities and it will generate power for 65 years. A solar facility, maybe 25 to 30 years, and you can't recycle the solar panels. A turbine, wind turbine generation facility, maybe 25 to 30 years, but after 10 years, the generating capacity declines precipitously and you can't recycle the blades. So there is so much that the American public has been misled about, overpromised on, that it defies description at times. We can't totally abandon fossil fuels and think that we can power the entire economy, all of our vehicles, and everything else with renewables.
Congressman Gary Palmer, thank you.
Thanks for having me on, Steve.
On Monday, Vice President Kamala Harris announced her National Security Advisor, Nancy McEldowney, is resigning. McEldowney, a former diplomat, has had a decades-long foreign service career. Her resignation came at a critical time, with Harris taking a visible diplomatic role in responding to the Ukraine crisis. Harris has also seen a number of high-level staff resignations this year. McEldowney will be replaced by her deputy, Phil Gordon, who served in both the Obama and Clinton administrations. Alaska Congressman Don Young has died. Young served in Congress since 1973. He was one of the longest-serving members in the House. Young died on Friday while on a flight back to his home state of Alaska. Young had moved to Alaska in 1959, shortly after it became a state. Before entering politics, Young was a captain of a barge that supplied villages on the Yukon River. Alaska Governor Mike Dunleavy will announce dates of a special election to replace Young. Congressman Don Young was 88 years old. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the violent repression of the Muslim Rohingya population in Myanmar amounts to a genocide. He made a formal declaration at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum today.
Beyond the Holocaust, the United States has concluded that genocide was committed 7 times. Today marks the 8th, as I have determined that members of the Burmese military committed genocide and crimes against humanity against Rohingya.
The U.S. has already sanctioned several of Myanmar's military officials. Blinken's declaration will bring international pressure and lay a groundwork for future legal action. Blinken says it's also important to bring attention to rights abuses around the world.
But we must also stand with the people suffering atrocities in other places, like Xinjiang, where the Chinese government continues to commit genocide and crimes against humanity against predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and other minority groups.
The U.S. previously declared that the Chinese regime is committing genocide against Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities.